In 1968, a film starring John Wayne, David Janssen, and Jim Hutton arrived in local theaters in your area. That film was the war movie The Green Berets. The movie was directed by John Wayne and Ray Kellogg and was based on a 1965 novel of the same name written by Robin Moore. However, it bore very little resemblance to the original script. Now, everyone hated this movie. All the critics simply thought it was terrible. But this film was actually a box office success. So, who should we believe? I have to believe the audience. And they went out and saw this movie in droves. This happens all the time, where critics dislike the ideas behind a movie and simply tear it apart in their reviews. And that's what happened because the popularity of the Vietnam War was a topic everyone was dealing with at the time. John Wayne firmly believed that the extremely negative reviews probably helped the movie's box office performance. He also thought the critics were attacking the war itself rather than his movie. In 1967, John Wayne wrote a letter to the Democratic president, Lyndon B. Johnson, requesting military assistance for his film. The Department of Defense had previously assisted other war films, such as The Guns of Navarone and The Longest Day. Jack Gallanty told the president that John Wayne's political views were incorrect. But as far as Vietnam was concerned, his opinions were right. John Wayne received enough support from the Department of Defense to make the movie. And all of this was because President Johnson gave it the green light and said it was okay. These two men differed politically quite a bit, but Johnson was involved in the war and was trying to justify continued U.S. participation. The character played by David Janssen, Colonel Mike Kirby, was based on a real person named Lauri Torni, later known as Larry Thorne. He was a Finnish army captain who fought in World War II. He immigrated to the United States in the late 1940s and joined the U.S. Army in 1954. In November 1963, he joined the Special Services Unit A, 734 and fought in the Mekong Delta. He went missing during a mission in 1965 and was reported as such at the time. His remains were found in 1999 and formally identified in 2003. Now, many of the actors in this film, such as John Wayne, Jim Hutton, and George Takei, were completely against the Vietnam War and really had to think long and hard before making this movie. Jim Hutton's role in the film was mistakenly identified as sharing John Wayne's views, while Wayne himself initially supported the war during filming. George Takei even approached John Wayne and told him he was against the war. Wayne responded, saying that half the cast and crew were also against the war. He told Takei that he had hired him for his acting ability, not for his political opinions. Wayne faced many difficulties in making this film. Studios didn't want to fund it, people didn't want to be involved in it, and he even wanted his friend, Elmer Bernstein, to compose the film's score. However, Bernstein felt compelled to decline because it didn't align with his personal politics. Warner Brothers was very hesitant to let John Wayne direct the movie, as his previous directorial effort, The Alamo, 1960, had been quite expensive, so they only agreed to let him do it if he had a co-director with more experience. Wayne chose Ray Kellogg. The studio agreed, despite Kellogg only having experience directing a few B-movies. However, he had a solid track record as a second-unit director, which was used multiple times in this production. John Wayne came up with the idea for this film after visiting Vietnam in June 1966 to entertain the troops. Some of the Vietnamese village sets were so realistic that they were left intact after filming and were later used by the U.S. Army to train soldiers deploying to Vietnam. Much of the film was shot in 1967 at Fort Benning, Georgia, which is why there is a lot of pine forest in the background instead of tropical jungle trees. The Vietnamese characters in the film were played by Japanese actors. All the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers were armed with single-shot rifles, and very few had automatic weapons. This was plausible in the early years of the Vietnam War, as many Viet Cong were armed with World War II-era weapons. It has been claimed that John Wayne turned down Lee Marvin's role in The Dirty Dozen, 1967, to make this film. However, The Dirty Dozen was filmed in early 1966, while The Green Berets was made in the second half of 1967. Other sources claim that Wayne actually turned down The Dirty Dozen because he didn't want to be filming in the UK when his wife was about to give birth in February 1966. John Wayne was absolutely determined to have the Ballad of the Green Berets in the opening credits. Others involved in the production felt it wasn't the right choice, thinking it was too cheesy and outdated. This was John Wayne's last war film. While there are some war scenes in The Undefeated, 1969, and Rio Lobo, 1970, The Green Berets was his last true war movie. There was a lot of criticism about John Wayne's age in this movie, as well as that of some other cast members. Most of the actors were significantly older than the average American soldier in Vietnam, who was only 19 years old. Scenes featuring Vera Miles as John Wayne's wife were filmed, but were cut by the studio before the film's release. The scene only took one morning to shoot, but the film was already quite long, and they felt it could easily be removed. Wayne's company, Batjack Productions, offered Vera Miles $10,000 for her work on the film. When she declined, they offered her a new car, which she also refused. To make up for it, Wayne cast her in his next movie, Hellfighters. However, Wayne later admitted that, considering how bad Hellfighters was, it wasn't much of a compensation for her. During filming, John Wayne truly believed that the Vietnam War could be won. He wanted to do everything he could to make a movie that portrayed the war in a better light. In reality, most war correspondents initially supported U.S. involvement in Vietnam, but changed their views after visiting the country. Despite assurances that actor Aldo Ray would remain sober throughout filming, he relapsed midway through production and was frequently too drunk to say his lines. John Wayne was forced to rewrite some of his dialogue and reassign his lines to other characters. Wayne was deeply frustrated by this and constantly argued with Ray over his lack of professionalism. Ray continued to struggle with alcoholism for years and eventually died in financial ruin. He had once been a top-tier performer, a wealthy man who had made smart real estate investments, but alcohol led him down a path from which he never recovered. Ray was also irritated by Wayne's frustration with him and later made disparaging remarks about Wayne after production ended. Ray was an extremely talented actor, and it's tragic that he fell into the trap of alcohol abuse. Now, despite the terrible reviews from critics and despite being protested and boycotted both in the US and abroad, The Green Berets became a massive commercial success. Check out this movie. I think you might like it. It's one of those films that often gets overlooked in John Wayne's filmography.